Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Day 2 of the Richard Nixon Foundation's Grand Strategy Summit. Throughout the day, we will be joined by a number of members of the Board of Directors of the Richard Nixon Foundation, including Christopher Nixon Cox, the eldest grandson of President and Mrs. Nixon, representing the Nixon family, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, Lisa Arduous, Ambassador Callista Gingrich, Blake Kernan, Bill Kilberg, Bobby Kilberg, Marlene Malik, and Charlie Zhang. So thanks to all the members of the board who will be here, and thank you for your support. I also want to recognize a few organizations who helped to promote the Grand Strategy Summit far and wide, including the Vandenberg Coalition, the Former Members of Congress Association, the Association of Republican Presidential Appointees, the America First Policy Institute, the Alexander Hamilton Society, the American Enterprise Institute, Pepperdine University, and the Naval War College. And I know there's a number of representatives from those groups here this morning, so thank you for your support. Now let's get into this morning's program. Last year, at this conference and on this stage, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich said, quote, "Grand strategies require bold vision and a lot of specific incremental steps. It happens very rarely. It involves people who are remarkable, and President Nixon was one of those people." 50 years later, after the Nixon presidency, we find ourselves living in a very different world. So let us ask, what are the ingredients? What is the composition of a 21st century American grand strategy? To lead this discussion, to look at the status of the Russia-Ukraine war and what it will mean long-term for American statecraft, it's my pleasure to introduce Jacqui Heinrich, Fox News White House correspondent, and she will introduce our panelists.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see you here. So today, President Richard Nixon would not have been surprised that the fledgling democracy in Russia under former President Boris Yeltsin dissolved, or that Russia's nationalist regime took hold under the likes of Vladimir Putin. He would also not be surprised that Moscow's relations with Kyiv worsened to the point that the United States finds itself in today, supporting Ukraine's defense of its democracy, holding the door against a possible Russian invasion of a neighboring NATO ally that could embroil the U.S. in a war with a nuclear power. On March 16, 1994, Nixon, in a press conference with the Ukrainian president, prophesied that one day the United States would face a terrible choice. There is no doubt that sometime in the future there will be occasions when the U.S. will have to look at Ukraine and Russia and say, "Who do we choose?" he said that day. Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk urged there should be no serious confrontations and no conflict between Ukraine and Russia, because this threatens the whole world, not just Russia and Ukraine, he said. Doesn't that sound familiar? Nixon said he expected the threat of nationalism in Russia would recede once economic prosperity took hold, and he dismissed suggestions that Russia was about to make a move militarily. But privately, he was much more concerned. 5 days after that press conference made headlines, Nixon wrote a letter to President Clinton, the contents of which were kept secret for the next 30 years until it was declassified this past June. And its contents are striking. Nixon, who was then 81 years old, detailed his 2-week trip to Russia and Ukraine, anticipating a much more belligerent Russia that would give rise to someone like Vladimir Putin that we have today. And he warned that Yeltsin's brief experiment with democracy was already over. He said, "I have reluctantly concluded that his situation has rapidly deteriorated since the elections in December, and that the days of his unquestioned leadership of Russia are numbered," Nixon wrote to Clinton. "His drinking bouts are longer, and his periods of depression are more frequent and most troublesome. He can no longer deliver on his commitments to you and other Western leaders in an increasingly anti-American environment in the Duma and in the country." Nixon predicted worsening relations between Moscow and Kyiv, calling the situation highly explosive. He wrote, "If it is allowed to get out of control, it will make Bosnia look like a PTA garden party." Nixon urged Clinton to take this issue seriously and to strengthen U.S. diplomacy in Kyiv, and to anticipate and help cultivate Yeltsin's successor. And he shared his disdain for career diplomats, telling Clinton that some of the best decisions that he made in his time as president were without the approval of or over the objections of most Foreign Service officers. And Nixon warned Clinton not to be held back by his staff. When Clinton eulogized Nixon the following year, he spoke of the wise counsel he received with regard to Russia, and in 2013, Clinton said he found himself wishing that he could pick up the phone and ask Nixon for his thoughts on issues, particular ones involving Russia. So today, in that spirit, we are going to examine the questions that we are facing as a country. The future of U.S. support for Ukraine, especially as Americans are increasingly viewing Ukraine aid as a binary choice, help defend Ukraine's border or secure the United States southern border, for instance. We'll also consider what should happen when the war comes to an end. What should be the U.S. role in rebuilding infrastructure, and to what strategic end? And we'll consider this against the backdrop of a looming Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and now also our greatest ally in the Middle East, Israel, at war. So for this discussion, I want to welcome Congresswoman Jane Harman of California, Chair of the Commission on National Defense Strategy. Admiral Mike Rogers, former Commissioner of U.S. Cyber Command and former Director of the National Security Agency. And Congressman Mike Waltz, a Green Beret who formerly advised the Pentagon and the White House and currently sits on the Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and Armed Services Committees. So we'll get right to it. When it comes to support for Ukraine, the question today really that we want to examine is how realistic is as long as it takes. Congressman Waltz, I know you have some thoughts on this, so I'll have you lead us off.
Well, thanks, and thanks so much to the Nixon Foundation, and certainly couldn't be a more timely time to have this discussion as we have yet another large supplemental spending package coming our way, and thank you, Jacqui, for moderating today, and great to be with you. Look, I think to be very blunt and succinct, the blank check, as long as it takes strategy and approach or lack of a strategy, is not sustainable. And I want to caveat that very strongly and say I have supported and do believe it is in our national interest to stop Putin. I do believe he will try to realize his longtime goal of reconstituting the old Soviet Union. That would involve some NATO countries, and the best way heretofore to have kept us out of the war is to give the Ukrainians the beans and bullets to do the fighting. However, a number of folks on my side of the aisle and a number of folks that have been supportive are enormously frustrated with how this administration in many ways has slow-rolled us by not providing what the Ukrainians had asked for up front when they were in a position to decisively win. And we can go down that long list from Harpoons to Patriots to ATACMS to cluster munitions to tanks to F-16. I mean, it literally is probably a longer list than we have today. So I think going forward, now that we have this war is settling into a war of attrition, it has settled into a stalemate. I do believe the president has failed to articulate to the American people what success looks like, what victory looks like in line with U.S. interests, how long is it going to take, how much is it going to cost, how many times will he come to the Congress and the American taxpayer and ask them to dig ever deeper. And I think there is room between as long as it takes and not another dollar. There's a lot of room between those two very black and white positions, and the administration has not filled that void and has not consistently taken the case to the American people. Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, we can name the president, I think would have had multiple primetime Oval Office addresses by now making that case, and he hasn't done so. And in the context of our border being out of control, inflation continuing to rise every time somebody goes to the gas pump, people, particularly on fixed income, hurting, not seeing the Europeans step up in a truly fair way, the big European economies, not the Baltics and the Poles. People are rightfully asking questions. How long is this going to go? And oh, by the way, in the wake of the Afghanistan withdrawal and 20 years of that war, how long, how much, what does victory look like? And until we have those questions, until we have those answers, to those questions, I think future packages are going to struggle mightily.
Congresswoman Harman, I saw you nodding a bit. Do you want to respond?
Well, let me add a few things. I don't know that I'm exactly responding, but it's nice to be here. I've just learned that my dear friends, the Kilbergs, are very involved here. I can't see if they're in the audience, but
They were here last night.
They were there last night, so love and affection. Bill was a classmate of mine at law school and a distant cousin, and I've known them for absolutely ever, so there. But I'm looking out at the name of this event where we're speaking. It's called Grand Strategy Summit. And let me suggest that that is the root of our problem. I wrote a book when I left Congress in 2011 after 17 years, or maybe that was 200 years. But I'd point out that during that time, we actually balanced the federal budget, something to marvel at. Maybe it was a total accident, but I remember the vote in 1997 when both parties came together on a large bipartisan basis, and we had a surplus for a few years. Just contemplate that. But at any rate, after I left Congress and just after I left the Wilson Center, which I headed for 10 years following that, I wrote a book, the title of which my daughter picked is Insanity Defense: Why Our Failure to Confront Hard National Security Problems Makes Us Less Safe. And the premise of the book is that when the Cold War ended, which was a huge victory for Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and others, we didn't have a post-Cold War strategy. We thought we won, everybody else lost, and they all want to be us. So what happened in the 90s? And I was there. I was elected to Congress in 1992. If anyone remembers the so-called Year of the Woman. Does anyone remember that? Anyway, never mind. So what did we miss in the 90s? Just about everything. We missed the rise of China, because we thought China wants to be us. China should be in the WTO, and then China will be us. We missed the rise of terrorism. I was on the Intel Committee, as you know, Mike, and a ranking member for 4 years after 9/11. I was on a commission that predicted one of three, a major attack on U.S. soil by terrorists. It was ignored, and then came 9/11. So we missed the rise of terrorism in spite of hits in our embassies in Africa. And we missed the rise of Russian grievance. They were totally, especially Vladimir Putin, offended by the way his country was treated. Not that it should have, well, we treated the losers differently after World War II. There were lessons. And we missed the rise of Russian grievance, among other things. And then came 9/11, and we had that was justifiably a watershed moment in American history. And we did some things right after 9/11, and we did some things wrong. And I agree with President Biden, who said that in Tel Aviv yesterday. And let's hope others learn our lessons. Let's hope we learn our lessons. But the point is, we did not have a strategy, and we're still paying for that. And I am strongly for, I don't think this Mike or that Mike would say differently, the Ukrainians winning. But a couple of points about that. Just talking about Ukraine aid in a vacuum, it's this many dollars compared to that many dollars for the border, is tactical and not strategic. What we should be talking about is and what we should have been talking about for years, is what does our overall budget look like? What are the big puzzle pieces, and how do we shape them to be reasonable for America's future? And we're not doing that. We've taken pieces of the budget off. We've made them off limits, entitlements, for example. I'll say it, and I said it in Congress. I was a so-called blue dog, which were the fiscally...
She said it.
I said it. Fiscally responsible Democrats. And entitlement reform is important because the Medicare Trust Fund and the Social Security Trust Fund are going to go bankrupt in 2030. So if we want to keep those things, we have to reform them. Tax reform is a thing to talk about. Budget reform and lowering a reasonable budget is something to talk about. Anyway, that's background to this question. Do I support more aid for Ukraine? You bet. Do I support aid for Israel? You bet. Do I support cuts in other parts of the budget? Yes. Do I think the border needs fixing? Yes. But taking each one of these up and looking at them as a zero-sum game, I think, is a very counterproductive way to go at this. And I do agree with you, Mike, that Ukraine should have gotten its aid faster. I think the Biden administration was afraid of provoking war with China, with Russia. Well, excuse me, there is war between Russia and Ukraine. And I don't think that we gained anything, and maybe we lost something by proceeding so slowly. But one other point about that. I give Biden enormous credit for restoring our alliances. And I think to some extent, the slow rolling at the beginning had to do with NATO and waiting to make sure the NATO countries were going to join us. And you can say they're slow rolling too. I do understand that Germany right now has missiles Ukraine could use, and it boggles my mind why they don't have those missiles to blow up the Kerch Bridge, which is the land bridge between Russia and Crimea. Crimea is in Ukraine, not Russia, and it is used to resupply the front in Ukraine. So I would think that would make a lot of sense. So my bottom line is, Mike is right, but the context is sadly so unstrategic that we're in a situation that is, I think, very unfortunate.
Admiral Rogers, I want to have you pick up where they left off, but also add on to that, the U.S. has not clearly communicated what the objective is here, because they're quick to say that Ukraine is going to determine its future in the terms of any peace. Should the U.S. be more involved in shaping that?
When I look at the problem as a military, I go, okay, we got a fundamental disconnect between our objective and our strategy. Am I going in and out? Okay, apologize. If the objective is to drive the Russians out of all, thanks you guys. If the objective, you have a real upward microphone today. Check, okay. If the objective is to drive the Russians out of all territory that is Ukraine, as originally constituted prior to the conflict, and I don't mean the conflict that started in 2022, I mean the conflict that started in February of 2014, when the Russians went into Crimea and also moved forces into the Donbass, the ethnic Russian region of eastern Ukraine. That appears to be the stated objective. The strategy seems to be, so we will use Ukraine's capacity, the will of its populace, its military capacity. We will support that financially, militarily, and that is how we will achieve this end state. Except to me, I'm watching a strategy that says, to Jane's point about, because, and it is a valid concern, we don't want this conflict to escalate into something broader with the Russians, that has driven us to a strategy of incrementalism, where every seemingly 90 days or so, we decide, we're gonna give you a weapon you asked for a year ago. And as a military guy, I go, look, a strategy of incrementalism generally leads to protracted conflicts with a higher cost. And I mean both in terms of monetary, but also most importantly in terms of people and the damage that's gonna be inflicted in the battle space. Add on top of that now, we've got an additional conflict going on now in the Gaza in which we as a nation are committed to supporting Israel with many of the same capabilities that are in Ukraine. And we have already talked about, in terms of military support to Ukraine, we are at maximum capacity in terms of the ability to generate more weapons, more munitions, and now we're gonna add on an additional requirement. So my view is, as a military guy, guys, either change your objective or change your strategy. But the way we're doing this right now, it is not going to get us where we said we want to be, and it's only going to prolong it, and that's just not good. And it also, the longer this goes on, the last point I would make, the longer this goes on, the greater the ability to sustain political will. You have had to deal with this in your professional lives. The tougher it is to sustain the political will to do this. And quite frankly, time, I would suspect, Putin believes is on his side. The longer this goes on, the greater the probability he believes that he will ultimately be successful. That is not a good place for us to be.
Congressman Waltz.
Yeah, no, and I'll just add to this war of attrition that frankly, I think slow rolling and dithering has backed us into. From a political standpoint, to then say, well, if you have questions, if you have concerns, if you're demanding before we keep writing the American taxpayers' checks, burden sharing, or a realistic end state, therefore you then are pro-Russian and don't support democracy, is frankly insulting. I think the American people rightly have those questions and should have those questions. So the Admiral is absolutely right. On the other side of the ledger, you have North Korea opening up its foundries. That's not anything that is classified. There's open source reporting of ships leaving Pyongyang and delivering large containers after the Putin summit with the leader of North Korea. So they're opening their foundries. We know Iran is providing drone manufacturing and other types of capabilities. Russia is in it for the long haul. There are other former and current allies providing munitions as well. Yet we're limited on our side. We are at capacity from our industrial base, which this war has exposed some serious shortfalls in our industrial base. Who's going to fill that void? I would argue the large economies of Europe should be filling that void. Right now, as we speak, 9 of the 31 NATO countries are living up to their 2% GDP defense commitments from 10 years ago, commitments they made a decade ago, pre-2014. They didn't get the message in 2014, and they're not getting the message now. In fact, Germany, of all countries, just formally backed away from its 2% commitment. There's been a lot of talk the last 2 years, a lot of promises, but when it came down to a vote in their parliament, they voted it down. And my question is, if we can't get, I'm not talking Estonia, Latvia, the Baltics, and Poland, because the administration repeatedly puts these kind of misleading fact sheets out of, well, the United States per capita GDP is middle of the pack, all of these other countries ahead. Look, the actual dollar amounts are de minimis in terms of God bless them, they're fully committed because they know they're next. But in terms of the countries that could actually make a difference and move the needle, Germany, France, Italy, if you look at their actual deliveries, the other kind of long-time tactic in these ministerials is to make a lot of pledges. You have to watch what's actually delivered over time. France, for example, is providing a fourth the amount that Poland is, despite having an economy 4 times as much as Poland. So again, my question is, if Europe isn't going to step up to its own defense needs now, with the largest land war since World War II literally on its doorstep, and the administration isn't going to hold their feet to the fire now, then when will we ever?
Well, why don't you write that legislation?
Well, I have. As a matter of fact, thank you very much. And it's called dollar for euro, in that we have to have parity. I think that's only fair to the American taxpayer that, and NATO has been a phenomenal, look, I want to be clear, an amazingly successful alliance throughout the Cold War and even post. We could have another debate on their performance in Afghanistan and living up to their pledges and promises then. However, we literally cannot afford, with $33 trillion in debt and climbing, the issues, the word that I won't say, that Jane rightly brought up. We cannot afford to continue subsidizing European defense particularly with the threats that we're facing in Asia and what's going on now in the Middle East. They have got to step up, and we're going to legislate them into that position. If the administration, they would do themselves a lot of favor if they were pounding the table in Europe instead of backslapping.
Well, could I
Go ahead.
make a few comments about that? I don't think the way forward is to do less because they're doing less. I think the way forward is to get them to do more and do more. It is impressive that some countries in Asia are stepping up to help us, like Japan, and that Japan has had an internal conversation. Remember, after Japan lost in World War II, instead of grinding them into the dirt, we figured out how to have an umbrella to protect Asia, which is still worthy of the idea, but they are increasing their ability to produce defense materiel and contemplating, anyway, amending their constitution to do even more. But my point is, parts of the world are stepping up. There is a problem, as you mentioned, Jackie. I had this Commission on National Defense Strategy, which is a quadrennial look at our national defense strategy, which was last issued in 2022. It's a bipartisan commission, and one of the big problems is the so-called DIB. If you don't know what that is, it sounds like an hors d'oeuvre, but it's the defense industrial base. And I represented an aerospace-dependent district in Los Angeles for all the 100 years I was in Congress, and back in that day, it was quite robust, even though we downsized our procurement budgets in the 90s. Now we have fallen short, and especially after COVID or during COVID, a lot of these facilities cut back on production of obvious things like munitions. And so guess what? We have a munitions shortage. Shame on us. You can blame whoever you want to blame, but the point is we've got to grow out of that quickly. And I'm sure everybody on this panel and all of you would agree with that. Certainly I do. But we have to grow into producing stuff we need to win the next war, not just protecting all the legacy projects that people like me used to fight to the death for because they were jobs in our districts. But let's understand, there are two new defense domains, cyber and space. Hello. So we've got to really leverage technology to think forward. But my bottom line is, I think we need more for more, not less for less.
Admiral, on the issue of conditionality that we've been talking about, there have been some efforts to make this happen already. Why hasn't that been enough? And is it even worthwhile to try to pursue this when we've been seeing recently support erode in Congress for continued Ukraine aid? We went from roughly having a third of House Republicans opposing continued aid package to half within the span of a few months. So what is it going to take to turn that around?
Well, if you look at history, a crisis or the perception of failure, we get a significant battlefield loss, if you will, or gain by the Russians, lost by Ukraine. Does that drive you to a different strategy? I'm not a political individual, but clearly the political dimension is such a key part of this in terms of our ability to sustain this level of effort with this strategy. And the fact that we now have got additional conflict makes that even harder. And to Jane's previous point, Ukraine, our strategy with Ukraine and the challenges of Ukraine exist in a broader context. And that broader context for us as a global entity that's focused on the entire world, not just on one particularly important, but one particular aspect of it. How, to the purpose of this entire 2 days, how do we create a grand strategy that actually enables us to address the challenges of Ukraine, but do it in a way that sustains a broader global effort for us that gets us to a better position in terms of our security, our prosperity, and the well-being of our friends and allies? Instead, we're looking to, again, Jane, although Mike said something very similar, instead we seem to be, everything gets looked through an individual microscope, and guys, this is not a sustainable approach for us. If you treat every issue as both independent and of critical importance, then you tell me how you come up with a coherent strategy to how we're going to do this. And I think that's an area. I think another challenge is we have got to help the American public understand, why is Ukraine important? Why should we be doing this? What is our strategy? Why do we believe that what we're doing will lead to this objective that we've talked about? And at the moment, something Mike said. It's an area where I don't think we have done the job we need to do. I think many American citizens, clearly not all, and I don't want to speak for all 335 million, but my sense is many Americans have said, okay, there doesn't seem to be much immediate impact to me in my daily life. Hey, if you want to keep spending this money and supporting, okay, fine. As we see Gaza, as we see other complexity over time, I think as the economic and inflation challenges grow, I think increasingly our citizens are going to say, could you help me understand why we're going down this road? Why are we spending this kind of money? Why is this strategy, do you believe, government? Why is this going to be effective? And I don't think we've really worked on that. And time, to me, time is against us. We are now 20 months into a conflict that initially most people thought would be some number of days or weeks. And the strategy seems to say, however long it takes, we're comfortable. I don't think that that's really going to work. I don't think that truly, however long it takes, is a sustainable approach. I just don't think you live in this environment. I don't think you can sustain that.
Congresswoman, I see you wanting to respond.
There's a lot there, but I think we have done a poor job over many administrations selling why American leadership in the world matters. I think we've done a poor job. I think the good news is that Mike and a number of veterans are now serving in Congress, and are willing, are great patriots in both parties, to explain why they made a commitment. And this Mike too, but he didn't, he was a little smarter. He didn't serve in Congress. Never mind. Sorry, that was an aside.
Too many Mike Rogers there already, so.
Yeah, it's kind of, the name is a little redundant, just saying. Although the others with your name are pretty impressive too. But back to this. We have not explained why American leadership matters. It was axiomatic after World War II, and it was axiomatic through the Reagan administration, I would say. And then what happened? I don't know. I mean, I'm not blaming a particular president, but because we've undersold it, there's now this undercurrent of isolationism in our country, which I think is enormously scary. We can't build walls high enough. This is not to pick on the wall on the southern border, but we can't keep out challenges that don't respect walls or nation states, like, let's go there, cyber, AI, climate, terrorism in various forms. We can't build the walls high enough. We have to be a player in the world. And just this week, I think Mike mentioned it, there was this summit in China with Putin there, the Belt and Road Summit. And China had 140 countries in a meeting talking about how China's vision of the world is important and I'm sure by their lights, the dominant, appropriate one. And here we are. We can't even get a speaker elected in the House. This is the contrast is just visible and sad.
Congressman Waltz, you live in a district where selling this kind of a message is pretty difficult, and we're entering a time where we have more isolationist kinds of voices that are gaining popularity among voters. You know, how can we balance the need to message to Russia that we were going to continue sending billions of dollars to try to dissuade them from the idea that they can outlast us, while also not letting those announcements of billions more here and billions more there convince your constituents that we can't afford to pay for this?
This is what's so frustrating. I mean, we have closed-door meetings. I've told the administration, come behind closed doors. No one in the Kremlin, I hope, is going to hear what we're talking about. But can we have an honest conversation on not what Zelensky wants. As long as Zelensky has a blank check, he is going to push as far and as long as he can to get as much of his territory back as he can. But behind closed doors, with the people that are constitutionally given oversight responsibility and the checkbook for the American people, tell us what the end state looks like. Is it 2014 line? Is it all of the Donbass? Is it all of Crimea? What is it? And how long and how much do we estimate it's going to cost given the current situation? and we can't get an answer then. So either the administration has made a deliberate decision to not make a decision, they can't get a decision out of the president, he's not sure, I don't know, but it is, I'm not going to sign off on any more of the taxpayer dollars. And I just wanted to add one thing, until we get that strategy, until we get burden sharing, just two more points. I think the administration's energy policy has also led to a lot of this, and a lot of frustration. You know, every time Putin has invaded a neighbor, 08, 14, 21, 22, the price of oil has been over $100 a barrel. Why are we not flooding the market right now with cheap and cleaner American oil and gas? We should be driving those coffers down. Russia, and we should be driving that price down. And oh, by the way, it alleviates a lot of the concerns and burdens that my constituents have. I mean, as Jane and Mike rightly said, this is not, you know, the administration talks about this as a singular issue. They're looking at it through the context of their daily lives and saying, whoa, wait a minute. You know, we're talking about deficits, we're talking about cutting back, we're talking about smaller government services, whether you're a veteran or a truck driver, whomever, and it's just not clear where all the money's going. And just last point on that, from the analysis I've seen, Russia is selling just as much of its oil as it was pre-war. They're just doing it through Hong Kong and they're doing it through India. I was just out in Delhi and they are processing it, and it's going right via ship now rather than pipeline right into the same markets into Europe. So nothing's changed except that Russia's making a bit less money, but they're still making plenty to fund this war machine in perpetuity. So we're literally working against ourselves, and it's asinine, and I think a lot of the American people have said enough.
Can I just
Go ahead.
ask a question? Yes, this does work. I agree with the strategy of flooding the market, by the way, with LNG, American LNG. And I think Europe was slow to build ports, and I think some of that's happening. But I think that's a good idea, and the transition to greener fuel is a good thing, but we're not there yet. So why can't we do both?
Can you call President Biden and tell him that?
Yeah, okay, I'll call him. I think he's hopefully catching up on his sleep today. My God, that was a heroic trip. But seriously, my question is, don't we need American leadership in the world now? I mean, are we withdrawing? I asked that question about isolationism. It's not just isolationism, but why aren't we more vigorously selling the need for the U.S. to lead around the world? Because in this vacuum, others are selling their needs. China's doing it, Russia's doing it. The so-called global South is annoyed with us because they feel that over many years we have lectured them rather than listened to them. And China, you can say the Belt and Road Initiative is a one-way initiative because they build all the infrastructure. These countries are now in debt and have to pay them back, and they use Chinese workers to build it, but it's all over Africa and it's all over Latin America, and where are we? So question to this panel, because they're so smart, is do we still need American leadership?
And we're going to move on to rebuilding
can I
just shortly,
comment
but
as well?
you can.
I think we have to acknowledge, look, the perception of a weaker America, less engaged in the broader world around it, less willing to stand up for the foundational principles that belong. When I mean stand up, I mean commitment of resources, extension of political will, the ability to create broader coalitions. That perception, you can have an argument if it's true or not, but I think you have to acknowledge, look, in many parts of the world, that perception exists. When that perception exists, we see a much less stable world, and that's exactly what you're watching play out around us now. And so one of the things I would try to be saying to the American public is, you are watching the price of a thought that America is less involved, less willing. That is not in our best interest. Do you want this kind of instability, this kind of energy challenge, et cetera? I mean, I think we need to make a broader case here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I know you want to move on, Jackie, but
ahead,
I have to answer Jane's question because, yes, we have some discussion here of an isolationist, libertarian right. But to answer your question of why we aren't selling it, we also have a progressive left that is openly talking about the United States as not an exceptional country, that one that is at its core and its foundation and founding inherently racist, misogynist, and colonialist, and describing now Israel as a colonialist power. And when that is a overwhelming theme in our schools and our universities, and coming from the other side of the political extreme, and we're heading into an election year, I mean, it just doesn't. Yeah, I agree with you. I do think our adversaries smell a weakness in Washington right now. They smell opportunity, and we're seeing them absolutely on the march on every front.
Admiral Rogers, I wanted to ask you, before we move on to rebuilding, the idea of getting there. Russia's not going to give back occupied land, and to Congressman Waltz's point, Ukraine is not going to stop fighting as long as they have funding coming to them and until they have security guarantees. So what do you think about a peace agreement that's being tossed around now where Russian-occupied territory is ceded and Ukraine-controlled territory gets NATO membership?
Look, the challenge, I think, in terms of security guarantee, because the only way the Ukrainians would potentially agree to this if they truly believe that there was a meaningful security guarantee.
Hard to do after the Budapest Memorandum.
And exactly. I'm going, look, if you're in Kyiv, you're going, well, wait, we've been promised this before, and you didn't deliver. Why should we believe you this time? And to go again to this perception we've talked about, do you bet on a United States that you're concerned doesn't have the political will to potentially be there? A Europe that says one thing but seems to deliver something much less? Are you really confident given those circumstances? So I think that the probability of that really working practically right now is not high. I just don't see Kyiv confident with that, and I don't think the Russians would be inclined to say yes anyway. And the other thing is, based on Russian actions, can you truly believe an agreement that the Russians come to? So your strategy has got to be, are we really, there's a low probability the Russians would in fact guarantee never to come back. So does your strategy account for a probability they in fact would do something like this again? And are you really prepared to fight it? And I don't think that that's there right now yet.
Let me just clarify that, though, because if they were to get NATO membership, are you saying that wouldn't be a strong enough security guarantee?
No, but the challenge with NATO membership for me is I think that's the long-term desired end state, personally, integrating Ukraine into the European security and economic, whether that's EU and NATO being the most visible signs of that. I do believe that is the appropriate long-term answer, but that's not a process that you do in 30 days. It just doesn't work that way. So we've got to come up with a strategy, to me, that accounts for those other things are going to take some period of time. What do you do now to convince both parties that you really want to go down that road?
And it also involves NATO agreeing, and NATO is not a monolith, as we are seeing, and the new election in Slovakia.
Right, that's one of the reasons why there's a big time element here. You just don't
signal
do it in 30 days.
Some divisions, although I think NATO will solidly remain in Ukraine's camp. But with the Article 5 Common Defense provision, which a country can invoke, it doesn't happen automatically. Wouldn't you think that Ukraine, as a member of NATO, would invoke Article 5 if there was, one tiny little piece of Russian aggression, and then the NATO countries are at war with Russia, which is something I don't think they are eager to seize. So I think that's been the reluctance for a while in terms of accepting Ukraine into NATO right now. As a longer-term goal, Mike, I agree totally with Mike. That's the plan. But there has to be true peace on the border with Russia. And according to Ukraine, and we could argue whether Ukraine gets to call the shots all by itself, but it is a sovereign country. They want all their territory back.
And remember, even if they become a member of NATO, Article 5 can be requested by a nation, but the North Atlantic Council must actually vote to approve for the alliance in Article 5. So again, it's a political process. It's not an automatic, hey, you've crossed the tripwire and it automatically goes. So it just goes to the complexity and the time component here.
So Congressman Waltz, what do we do? Because you often bring up the fact that China is watching what happens here. And this is all within, the context of a looming invasion of Taiwan, concerns that, you'd have a difficult time maintaining a NATO-type bloc against that sort of thing, and whether we'd be alone in that fight. So what do we do?
Well, I think, a few things. One of the key lessons that we have to learn is you have to arm your allies from a deterrence standpoint before the war starts, not after whole cities and regions have been devastated and then you start incrementally trickling things in. So that should be lesson one, and I was in Kyiv the month before the war, and everything they were asking for, anti-ship, stingers, you name it, there was this narrative of tapping the brakes in Washington. We don't want to provoke Putin. We don't want to be too escalatory. Slow down. And ironically, and that's where I think there's just a fundamental misunderstanding of deterrence in this administration that we're seeing over and over again, that's exactly what encouraged Putin to believe he could get away with it, was this kind of slow roll and frankly, risk aversion that was going on pre-war. So with Taiwan, number one, arm them to the teeth. Make it incredibly difficult. And I'm right now leading an FMS task force trying to peel back more and more of the red tape. We will only get so far, but trying to reform that process. Number two, and this is where I do give the administration some credit with the AUKUS agreement, we have to bolster those allies, particularly in the Quad. I'm also the Republican chair of the India caucus, the most important relationship of the 21st century. Number three, we have to continue to pull our supply chains out. If we can't get them in the United States, then let's get them in the Western Hemisphere or get them to an allied country like Australia and India. And then four, our dependencies that the Chinese Communist Party have deliberately and pointedly, in a matter of state policy, developed and created, this is going to be won or lost economically well before there's any type of military conflict. And just to add to Jane's point on Japan, South Korea, I give them a lot of credit. They're moving to their 2% of GDP commitment as a deterrent measure beforehand, before there is a massive conflict right on their doorstep. And I go back to Germany, Italy, and France that despite it already on their doorstep still are not. So I think as part of a long-term strategy, this is my other frustration. On the one hand, we're hearing analysts and the administration officials and others pat themselves on the back that the Russian military has been devastated in many ways. Thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces lost. Their Air Force incredibly damaged. Their stocks running low. But yet, if we move one U.S. soldier out of Europe, then suddenly our deterrence posture is going to be lost. It's really talking out of both sides of their mouth. I think we need to start looking over the horizon at reducing our force structure in Europe. The Russian military has been conventionally largely sidelined for the foreseeable future. That force structure needs to go to the Asia Pacific, and to the extent we have American troops left, then move them east. They need to be in Poland, they need to be in the Baltics, they need to be in Romania, and at the end of the day, we just cannot continue to sustain an all of the above blank check strategy around the world. We have to lead. But we have to demand that our partners and allies that have the economic capability to do so pull their fair share.
Well, can I add a few things to that? I agree, lead and demand much more of others. However, how about passing a defense budget on time? Funny little fact, we are wasting money on defense because of the way we do these continuing resolutions or shutting government, and we avoid getting to the next generation of weapons because we're, again, stuck in last year's funding. And the Pentagon, I don't think anyone would be surprised to learn, is kind of a slow adapter and has been forever. And this is one of the rants our little commission is making. Have to change the way we do procurement, have to, revitalize the defense industrial base, have to rethink how we recruit because the modern generation is very different and has different expectations, et cetera, et cetera. Have to confirm generals, just thought I'd put that out there. But all this junk, the drag from dysfunctional Congress is really hurting our defense capacity. So that's one. I do agree that we have to ramp up, but Taiwan's an interesting case, and I do agree we want to deter China from annexing, invading, blockading Taiwan. What I hear is that the readiness of Taiwanese soldiers is poor. It's really high in Ukraine, and I don't know exactly how to change that. But just put it on your agenda, Mike, because if they're not willing to fight, in spite of all the stuff we're going to help them get, that's really bad, and my view. And so I don't know what the answer is there, and I hope I'm wrong, but certainly that's some of the information I get.
This is going to sound parochial, but Ukraine had 8 years of Green Berets training him up, so I'm just,
So let's go.
So that explains it. Hey, one other thing about the challenges of continuing resolutions from a uniform perspective. Continuing resolutions are designed to sustain ongoing effort. What do you do when part of your strategy is it's about building and generating new capacities in cyber, in space, in other areas like, hey, new capabilities that'll help us were we to get into a conflict in China. And I have to admit, when I was Cyber Command, CRs used to frustrate the heck, because I'm going, guys, I'm trying to do new starts here. I can't get funding for what we need to do because I'm not behind existing programs. I'm trying to create new capability for the department.
And think what China might do before it annexes Taiwan as an aggressive intro to this. A massive cyber attack in the U.S., not that they haven't tried before. Are we ready for that? And has the American public been prepared for what might happen? Because it would be infrastructure in private hands that could be attacked, not just our defense infrastructure.
With less than 10 minutes left, I want to get to our final point, if we can envision for a moment that we're in the rebuilding phase here. And with respect to China, part of these questions, a couple things to chew on, Admiral. When it comes to rebuilding, we often look at the Marshall Plan, 1940s. Today's political climate might be different. How much will concerns about corruption, for instance, in Ukraine hamper success in getting that done? How would Nixon achieve that? And then also, what happens if the U.S. does not play a heavy role in rebuilding? Do we risk having the rest of the world view the wealthiest nation as walking away when the fighting is over? And how do you counter the threat of China gobbling up the reconstruction efforts?
Yeah, so
and what would that mean?
Lack of U.S. involvement in reconstruction, I think, offers opportunity for others to step in, and that is not in our long-term best interest. Secondly, look, if we think what we've encountered so far in Ukraine is challenging, I would argue the reconstruction dimension is even tougher. It's orders of magnitude in terms of cost. Depending on what figure you want to use, we're approaching $1 trillion of damage just in the territory that Ukraine still occupies. It doesn't include, if you're going to rebuild Crimea, the Donbass, the south and the east that are currently held by the Russians. Massive amount of money. If we think there's challenges sustaining political will to support a nation in a physical armed confrontation, what are the challenges of sustaining political will when you're going, we want you to write checks and there's no visible conflict? So we're going to, again, this communication idea about why we communicate, why this is important as strategy. And then lastly, clearly this is a coalition kind of approach. It isn't going to be the U.S. unilaterally going, okay, we got this, we did it after the Second World War through the Marshall Plan, we're on it. That won't sell politically here. That's not what we need to do. This is about how do you sustain a broader international coalition to do this.
Could I just offer a hopeful note? Why not? Just a thought. And it's not about Congress. Don't worry, Mike. the hopeful note is we have seized a lot of Russian assets. There are legal issues about what they can be used for, a bunch of yachts all over the place, et cetera, and country laws. I get that, it's tricky. But if we could use those assets, let's imagine somehow we get to an end state, whatever that is, some of those for rebuilding, seems to me that would be a good start. The other point that I wanted to offer that's more optimistic is Zelensky has taken steps to cut back on corruption. Endemic corruption has been a huge problem in Ukraine, as it was and is in Russia. That's part of the reason why the Russian entry salvo into Ukraine was so poor, because all the modernization funds had been siphoned off to build yachts. So Putin either didn't know that or didn't care. But point is, Zelensky has fired a bunch of generals, including his defense minister, et cetera. That's a good start. More has to happen. But there is an idea floating in Ukraine, because they are technically savvy, that they want to build a different economic model from other European countries, a startup nation model like the one in Israel. Don't know if that could get legs, but maybe it could get legs, and it could jumpstart all the corruption and all the backward-leaning development, if that's even a proper word, that was going on there for some years, and give them an opportunity to be a successful economy, much more successful than before this horror started.
Jacqui, I always have an open invitation I was just saying this to some Pentagon officials, but to kind of in the Beltway, DC think tankers or other analysts, others looking at this issue, open invitation to come to one of my town halls. And when I have a room full of teachers, underpaid teachers, underpaid first responders, firefighters, policemen, and women and others, and try to talk to them about why we're paying billions of dollars of Ukrainian first responder salaries, or we're sending billions of dollars of direct economic assistance into their economy when they're sitting there underpaid with their own needs, it is a non-starter. And I think one of the conversations we're having now on the Hill is, should the United States be looking at military aid only? What's the hardware that is going to end this war? And again, if we're talking about Europe stepping up and having its fair share, it's going to have to be in the non-military space and the world. I mean, H.W. Bush, Baker, Schultz, and others had a global 10-cup campaign in the first Gulf War saying, look, everyone is affected by this, then everyone needs to collectively step up, and they did. I'm not seeing that outside of this White House. I'm seeing, hey, Republicans, get on board, keep signing checks, and it's not going to happen. I'm not going to do it. It's just not sustainable, but I think it reflects the conversation around this is going to, again, go right back to what is our end state, and the conversation is going to shift from how do we win the war, because that's been completely ill-defined, to how do we end the war. And as we head into this election season, I think that is the conversation you're going to see more and more, and everything will then flow from that.
Admiral, did you want to expand on that at all? I saw you nodding a few times.
No, I mean, the challenge to me in some ways is this isn't just about resources. Because if you make it about only resources, I want guys, that's not sustainable for us. If this just becomes a dialogue about, well, it's just how big are the checks you're going to write, whether the check is for military assistance, humanitarian, economic, whatever. It's got to be about more than just the resource piece, and it's also got to be about how do we look for opportunity. I think Jay made a very important point. This also represents opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to project a different image, to create a different perception in the world around us. It's an opportunity for Ukraine to both address fundamental corruption issues, but also potentially recast itself in a different focus, economically, politically. And it's also, I think, an opportunity for Europe to show, hey, look, we are behind our words. Now, we'll see if we have the political will to do that, but I would be trying to show, look, there's great opportunity here if we're willing to do this. but it can't just be about how big a check are you going to write. That's just not a good place.
30-second point is I wanted to, Jane brought up a great point on the Russian foreign currency reserves that are currently sitting frozen, and by some estimates to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. We are working with the lawyers at Treasury. This will be a bit of a Pandora's box if you literally take and spend foreign currency reserves and how that then affects the international banking system. But that is legislation that is being actively discussed. Make Russia pay for Ukraine's rebuilding. But we need these types of ideas instead of here's another supplemental, here's another supplemental. It's just not going to work.
So it sounds like we're ending on a note of moving on from obligation and moving toward opportunity then, because we've been talking so much about how, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees. The U.S. is the defender of freedom and justice and liberty in the world, and our obligation to uphold that. Congresswoman, how do you shift the conversation to opportunity and have it matter to regular Americans, to voters who are maybe not paying as much attention to what's happening abroad?
Well, I love that question. I just love it. And one of my other gigs these days, I'm suffering for never saying no, including coming to this panel and early in the morning. But I chair the board of something called Freedom House, which is the oldest human rights organization in America, strictly nonpartisan. And to make a bigger point, I have been insistent that we have a bipartisan co-chairmanship. And so the new co-chair will be somebody named Wendell Willkie, who is the grandson of Wendell Willkie, who was the opponent of Franklin Roosevelt back in 1940, lost, and then formed this organization with, wait for this, Eleanor Roosevelt and a few others. And it puts out a Freedom in the World report every year that's highly respected, which shows, surprise, freedom's going down. What is my point about this? My point is that selling freedom in the world is one of America's best weapons. Freedom in America, too. And I don't disagree, by the way, Mike, that some of the isolationism and I wouldn't call it libertarianism, but I don't want to use the W word, some word, that both the left and the right are responsible for refusing to embrace the robustness of American democracy and letting us talk about issues where we disagree. That used to be what we did. We just did it on this stage, although I don't think we disagreed too much. But my point is, selling freedom is something we can do. China can't do that. Russia can't do that. I don't agree that we should have a military-only foreign whatever you call it, defense budget, because I think selling our soft power is extremely powerful. And things like American culture, it may sound a little silly, but very popular. You talk about India. India has a robust film industry because of us. It's modeled on ours, and that's a big deal there. And so my bottom line is we have tools that we are not using. And part of the problem is we have a dysfunctional Congress. Another part of the problem is we have presidents who have not sold it well. And the last president we had who sold it well, as I look back on it, was Ronald Reagan. And I think Ronald Reagan's vision of the shining city on the hill is an enduring vision of what America should be.
We're going to have to leave it there. We are out of time, but this has been a great discussion. Congresswoman Jane Harman, Admiral Mike Rogers, Congressman Mike Waltz, thank you all for being here.